All right, welcome everybody back to a very different episode of the Mike Sinello Show. Today we're going to have my Joe DeGregorio on to have a discussion about intellectual property. So, Joe, thanks for coming on the show.
You're welcome, Mike. Thanks for having me.
All right, so normally before we get into any show, I would give my guests an opportunity to plug themselves. I would say something along the lines of, "So, how can people reach you?" Today we've decided to do something a little bit differently, a little bit different. Joe, you want to talk about that?
Sure. So being that, all the schools are closed down and everything, instead of plugging anything that I'm doing, or, my own business or whatever, I'd like to plug Camilla's Kitchen, Camilla's Cupboard, excuse me. They're a local not-for-profit whose mission is to provide all children in the town of New Milford year-round food access. And you would actually be surprised how many of those children that attend our schools and live in our community don't have access to food all year round. Um, and what they do in order to help provide for those kids is provide summer lunch and brunch, in school food pantries at New Milford's High School and Scotticoke Middle School, and as well as weekend and break bags to help the kids along when school is not in session. And I have a feeling that because school is currently not in session, there's a lot of kids out there who might really need help. And I would love if anyone out there could, donate or help out with Camilla's Cupboard, to go ahead and hit www.camillascupboard.com and reach out to them and, figure out how you might be able to best work out giving them a hand and, succeeding in their mission.
Cool. And we've put that link in this video's description. We're going to give them another shameless plug at the very end before we close off too, because that's how I like to roll with the show. And you know what? Why don't we go ahead and dive right into the topic? So this came up because Joe and I wanted to have a conversation about a topic that we in some way disagree on, and I don't know that we necessarily disagree on, and this is why I wanted to have this show. Today we're going to be doing intellectual property as basically a change my mind, and I'm not going to be doing it from the Crowder position, which is basically just here's an opportunity to debate, because I'm genuinely on the fence on this issue. I hate the concept of intellectual property, but I can see the utility in its protections. That's the short version of why I sit on the fence. I would love to hear an argument one way or the other for or against it. My mind can actually be changed. Joe, I think we want to start with basically just what do you think intellectual property is? And then after you answer that question, go ahead and dive right on in.
Okay. To the best of my understanding, and again, I wouldn't by any stretch of the imagination call myself an expert on the topic, um, but from what I've read, and I guess I'll just quote Wikipedia at this point because they had a pretty concise summary.
Excuse me,
There are
Joe.
four.
Can you turn your mic up just a hair?
Sure, I could turn it towards me just a hair. Is that better?
Yeah, that's a little better. All right, go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't interrupt you.
Um, Yeah, no problem. There's four types of intellectual property. There's copyrights, patents, trademarks, and trade secrets. Copyrights are exclusive rights given to the creator of a creative work. A patent is a form of intellectual property that gives the owner the legal right to exclude others from making, using, selling, and importing an invention for a limited period of years. And then there's trademarks, also written trademarks and so on, that are intellectual property consisting of a recognized sign, design, or expression that helps a consumer to identify that particular person or business's product or service. And then there's trade secrets, which are a type of intellectual property that comprise formulas, practices, processes, designs, instruments, patterns, so on and so forth. Basically, and it actually jurisdictionally, trade secrets can be a little bit different from place to place. So they can encompass, quite a few different things. A few years back with the fracking stuff, and everyone's like, "Oh, it's trade secrets what they're using in their fracking water to go in there," and everyone wanted to find out what they were using for hydraulic fracturing because they could have been contaminating groundwater, but it was covered by trade secrets. So that was a big point of contention a few years ago. Um, my personal stance on it, and I'll kind of give a nod to trademarks in particular. In that I see the value in trademarks. I think that it's important that, I'm drinking Stella Artois, while we're having our conversation here, right? That shameless plug for the beer I like. It's got my daughter's name on it. How could I not like it? Right? like I want to know that when I buy a bottle of Stella Artois, right, that that's what I'm buying, right? So there's value in having that identifier. Personally, the other stuff is the stuff that kind of bothers me, because I kind of feel like we create laws in general to protect us from the parts of society that we don't otherwise want to face, right? The depraved, deranged, self-interested bits that we like to politely keep from other people, right? So, um, you know, uh, um, things that tug at us, to try to get what's ours and screw everybody else, and that insatiable urge to grab the last roll of toilet paper off the shelf because you might be running out. You know, um, uh, and intellectual property kind of lends itself to that sort of thinking, where especially with like patents, you could actually legally bar other people from using your ideas unless they buy that information from you or pay you an exorbitant fee. And I think that could be destructive, to the progression of society and and creative creative works and creative thinking, especially when you're starting to get into 70, 80 time spans that could actually exceed the life of the creator. um, but we'll kind of, I guess we'll delve into some more of that as we move forward.
Yeah. So I think that your definition needs a little bit more refinement. And I'm not saying that it's wrong. I want to pick at it for a little while here.
Yeah,
Um,
good.
so I want to boil it down to its roots, which is basically just that intellectual property are just simply ideas that you have coined, right? That have come from a specific source, right?
Yeah,
So
I don't. Okay, keep going, keep going.
So for example, if you talk about a trademark, well, the trademark came from my invention, right, and not from the tangible thing necessarily, but that I've invented, but came from my brain, right? It's taking my creative talent and putting it to a concept, right? So it doesn't have to necessarily be tangible like a trademark. It doesn't have to be necessarily tangible like like an invention that's actually tangible. I wish I had my invention up here, so I could use it as a visual because it's a really cool visual aid. But if you talk about things like software is something that exists effectively in the ether. You can't touch software. That's why it's called software and not hardware. And there that to me is something that we would define as intellectual property because it's taking your brain power, your ideas, and putting them out into the ether conceptually. So that I think that's what we're talking about here is just the protection of somebody's innovative ideas. And I'd love to pick your brain about the private protection of these sort of things versus the public protection of these sort of things. I may be stepping too far into this conversation, but for example, if you've got your own software and you're privately protecting the code, is there something immoral about that rather than releasing the source code to the public versus having a state protection of that source code?
So are you talking about personal ownership of a particular line of code, or personal ownership of the idea of what that line of code does, or maybe how you programmed it?
I think that in terms of intellectual property, we should specifically be talking about the thing itself, not necessarily what it does, because the goal to be achieved is something that exists without a human being, right? So if we want water to flow uphill, water can flow uphill in some hypothetical planet where we have like the moon that's like the size of the sun going by the earth, I suppose, temporarily cause water to flow slightly uphill, right? That can happen without a human intervention, right? But the device which makes water flow uphill is the human invention. So do you see what I'm saying? Like, I don't think that the goal is the intellectual property.
There's a couple of let's unpackage it a little bit, right? So what you're saying is that an individual could come up with a piece of code, right, in his home, never release it to the world, right? Um, and we'll expand on this a little bit in a second to kind of see if I can figure out where you're coming from. And he's sitting here like me in front of my computer. He types up the code, never shares it with anybody. sends that information off to the patent office, never decides to use it, right? That person in particular owns that patent. Guy around the block, right, has no idea about the patent, never looked it up, let's say, right, has plausible deniability. This is a thing that happens all the time.
Yep.
It's actually is a scenario that happened with HTC, right?
Yep.
They ended up getting sued for a whole bunch of stuff, and comes up with the ideas entirely on their own, of their own volition, right? Had their own team of programmers or whatever, or the guy sitting at another computer,
Yep.
writes the exact same line of code, right? I mean, what is it? It's if you take a monkey and you put him in front of a keyboard, and let him type long enough, eventually he's going to write Shakespeare's Hamlet, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's the monkey's typing
And
thought
they come with the
experiment.
exact same thing. Yeah, yeah. That person who originally patented the idea and had no intention of using it can bar the other individual who has a functional use for it from using that particular line of code. And I think that that's not a moral stance to take in society, right?
Okay.
Now,
hold on.
Now, if someone came to your house and tried to forcibly get you to give it up, right? That's an entirely different. That's a protection of personal property, right? Like no one can force you to do anything, right? That's an injunction on your person.
So I'm actually still trying to just define intellectual property rather than get into the moralistic argument just yet. So can we agree that it's the human invention, it's the human conceptual idea that we're considering the intellectual property?
So what about a person who designs an AI, and that AI meta writes the code? Does that individual then own the rights to the code that the AI or the machine developed?
Well, before we get into that, is that intellectual property? I think it is an intellectual property if we're defining it as that. Now, is there a moral argument for an actual right to that property? I think that's a different conversation that we're going to get into eventually here. I just wanted to define our terms. So, yes, I think that if you build a hoe, right, and that hoe allows you now to work the soil so that you can have crops growing in that soil that you normally wouldn't be able to grow. I think that is your idea. I think that is a form of intellectual property by proxy, because you have to talk about the human origination.
All right, we can go with that. That's fine.
Okay. So then let's talk about the private protection versus the public protection. Because I think the public protection is an argument that we need to build from the moralistic perspective. And here's what I mean. Joe, you write a line of code, and it achieves this amazing goal. Are you familiar with the show Silicon Valley?
No, not at all.
All right. But let's say you write this code that is like unicorn code, right? Like something that is landmark, groundbreaking code. That let's say would split the server space required for data storage for cloud data storage by orders of magnitude, reduce it by orders of magnitude, right? So in order to get that code into a marketable product, you obviously need a capital backing, right? So you go in front of your VCs and you make your presentation, and you say, listen, I've invented this code. Here's our prototype of it in action. But no, you don't get to see the code, and no, we're not going to explain what the eureka moment of the code is. And if they tell you buzz, and if they say, well, then you then get out of here, so be it. The question I want to ask of you is it immoral for that person to individually and privately not release that code?
No, it's not immoral for that person individually to not release the code.
Okay. All right. So then I guess the question here isn't
I think the question is it immoral, or is it in some way wrong for the VC guy to then turn around and go to his buddy who writes code and go, can you write this? And if the guy goes, yeah, I could figure out how to write it, he turns around and writes it, and because a deal can't be struck with the first guy, he goes with his friend who circumvents the other guy entirely independent. I don't think the first guy has a right to tell the second guy, you can't try to come up with your own code to do this, or you have to figure out a way to get around my patent in order to be able to use this functionality, right? If he wants to go and invest his time and effort and money and his time and treasure into writing, the code or whatever, developing the product, whatever it's going to be, so be it. Let him go ahead and do that.
Okay, so I'm actually going to go ahead and allow me to play devil's advocate here because I'm genuinely on the fence in this matter. So I'm going to
Go
be
ahead.
arguing for a point I don't necessarily actually agree with. So forgive me, folks. But that's, I mean, there's no other way for me to get at a conclusion here than to play the devil's advocate in this situation. And that is that if if you have a right to privately protect that code, if there's no obligation whatsoever for you to release that information to the public, right? Then why would you not then have a right to protect that code? And why would the state not exist to help you protect that right?
All right, ask me that question again because I think you lost me there for a second.
Okay, so you and I agree, I think, that if an individual decides they're not going to release that code into the public domain, they have no obligation whatsoever to do that, right? No one can come to them
No,
and beat that code out of them, right?
nope.
So if they have a right to that code,
Hmm.
then they ought to have. Why would the state not have? Why would the state not exist but to protect that right?
The state does have a right to protect the code in their possession, right? Like, no one can go to that guy's house and forcibly remove him from his house, lock him in a gulag, you know, beat his friends in front of him or something like that to try to coerce him to do what they want them to. Like that's the immoral part of it is no one can force you to do it. Now, what you have to remember is that when you are dealing with a megalith corporation, right? Let's say like Microsoft or Apple or Google or HTC, whoever it is, Samsung, right? And you approach them and you say, "Hey, um, I have this really cool thing," and I actually have, I know people who have had this very personal experience, right? They come up with an idea, some technological idea. They approach a company, maybe more than one, maybe a dozen of them, and say, "Hey, I have this idea. I've patented this thing. I can take your business to the next level by doing X, Y, or Z," right? And the very first thing Microsoft does is go, "Oh, that's cool. Let us review it." They go back, they pull the patent, they see what you've done, right? Because in order to get your patent, you have to divulge all of that
Yep.
information out of the on the front end, right? They
Well,
go,
let's hold
they
on,
take
hold
it to
on.
their team of,
Let's
hold
let's
on, this,
let's
this is
pretend we're in a
very
world where there
important
is no
point to make,
patent. Let's pretend that we're in a world where there is no patent.
right? Um, then then if there is no patent, right, then Microsoft can't go and look at your code and see what you've done. You're inherently more valuable at that point, right? Because they don't know how you got from point A to point B, right?
And
So
I mean,
they might have a greater motivation to say, "Come and work for us, give us this idea, we'll pay you a certain amount of money up front," right? It might be more of an open door at that point, as opposed to them taking that information and going to their back office engineers and going, "Can we work around this, or do we need it?"
so where do you stand then on reverse engineering?
That's perfectly a reasonable thing to do. I mean,
So
do you think that? What do you think people did back in the time of Henry Ford? Do you think that every car manufacturer just came up with the idea of the internal combustion motor, or everyone actually paid him for it? No, people around the world went around and did it. If you look at from the inception of the United States up until the mid 1800s, right? The United States was the China of the world. We didn't really give a crap about intellectual property rights. They stole plays, they stole art, they stole technology, they stole literature, and everybody in the United States profited from it, right? Because we didn't have a very deep infrastructure or invested interest in protecting those things. We wanted the innovation, we wanted people to be able to create freely and to do whatever they did. And the government had incentive to allow it because it expanded business exponentially. The increase in intellectual property rights has really been more recent as a result of protecting corporate interest, not innovators and creators.
so then allow me to extend this from the moralistic to the utilitarian, which is not usually a strong argument, but allow us to extend this then to the utilitarian perspective, because you've argued that reverse engineering, there's nothing morally wrong with it, and there's no reason to have government actually protect you from it. So, in
Mike,
the
how did you figure out how to repair the brakes on a car? Did you read a book? Did someone teach you?
my
Or did
dad
you
taught
go
my
and
dad
go,
my, my dad showed me. I mean, you're talking about just like doing pads and rotors.
yeah,
Yeah,
your dad showed you,
I
right?
was like
And
15 years old. My dad showed me. Yeah.
so you effectively reverse engineered. Your dad said you take the tire off the car, and then you take the calipers off the car, and then this is what we do: we clean the rotors, put the new rotor on, we clean all our things, and then we bleed the brake lines, right? You
Yeah.
reverse engineered a victory from that.
I
If someone
I mean, I reverse engineered the victory from the auto mechanics perspective, but not from the manufacturer of the brake pad and rotors perspective, because I have no idea how to make a rotor or a brake pad.
But that's valuable knowledge that auto mechanic has, right?
Right. So I don't think that that's what people would consider. I don't think a specific skill necessarily is what people would consider intellectual property. I think it's the result of the skill. So, for example, if I invented a let's keep this as in the ether as we possibly can, and if I invented a way of using the already existing technologies that are out there to do the brake job much faster, right? That I think would be a trade secret. And you suggested that trade secrets are a form of intellectual property.
They are. They're protected.
Do you think the trade secrets should be protected by government?
Well, in what regard? I mean, again, it's like I don't feel that government has the right to force you to divulge that information, right? Unless there's some extenuating circumstance, right? Like again, with the fracking example, if you're injecting chemicals into the ground that could affect people's groundwater, there might need to be some sort of regulatory function just to ensure that you're not,
and there's actually there's a libertarian
using uranium or something crazy, right?
There's a libertarian argument for what you're talking about, and that is if I have a block of uranium, let's say I have a loaded gun, safety off, sitting on my countertop, and I have a block of super irradiated uranium sitting on my countertop. Well, the gun, unless I act upon it, isn't going to go shoot anybody, isn't going to be harmful at all to my neighbors. But the block of uranium just sitting there on the countertop is definitely going to be harmful to my neighbors who share a wall with me when that radioactive waste or when that radioactivity goes through the wall and gives them radiation poisoning and kills them in a matter of hours, right? So there is actually a libertarian argument because you've introduced somebody into a transaction who has not consented to entry into that transaction, which is my neighbor, right? So so I see what you're saying with the fracking. There is an argument for governmental involvement or regulatory involvement.
But now I don't think that Exxon or whoever's fracking. I don't know a major Bechtel or something. I don't know who fracks, whatever. I don't think they have to necessarily give that to anybody freely, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that the regulatory agency kind of collects that information and says, okay, you're not putting poison into the ground. You can go ahead and move forward. And maybe there's some sort of testing function periodically to ensure the information that's been given makes sense. Maybe the same thing with foods, right? Sort of the argument again for the FDA. You want to make sure that the stabilizers in the beer or Coca-Cola or whatever it is that you're buying aren't something that's going to be toxic to people. You want to make sure that right, that sort of thing. But again, I don't necessarily know that information needs to be freely divulged if it's a trade secret what they're using, right? You don't necessarily know how much each ingredient is in the package that you're buying, right? You only know that it's there. If you buy a can of Coke, it says sugar, whatever, right? They don't say this many grams of this and this many ounces of that per container.
Well, I mean, what makes for soda is relatively common knowledge. It's just that the process of mixing those ingredients is additionally a trade secret as well. So there may be an order of operations. This is true of wine,
right,
and beer, especially the breweries and vineyards out there. They have secrets as to just like how in Germany you're only allowed. The only thing you're allowed to have in your beer is water, hops, and yeast, right? Water, hops, and yeast. So I think, right? Is it 3 ingredients, or do you need the barley? I forget which. But you're only allowed to have those 3 or 4 ingredients. But the admixtures and how long you ferment out everything, how long you malt the wort, all of these sort of things can go into that, and that becomes trade secrets that aren't specific to the actual mixture itself. So I want to move on to, because I want to eventually come back to the moralistic argument here, but allow me to make the utilitarian argument, because we've said that there is no there's no moral obligation not to reverse engineer anything, and there's no reason for the state to protect against the reverse engineering. So As you probably know, it costs about $2.7 billion to get a drug to market in the US. Now, there's an entirely separate argument to be had, which I perfectly understand, about how the reason it costs so bloody much to get to market is because there isn't a free market on those goods, because the FDA regulates the absolute piss out of those things. And, the regulatory burden on the development of pharmaceuticals and drugs in this country is more stringent than any other country, and it's not close. Which is why, despite being the world's leader in actual innovation, the U.S. is very often the last country to see these innovations come to market. So they may come to market in India, they may come to market in Germany years before they come to market in the U.S. And And the $2.7 billion doesn't factor in drugs that never made it to market, never made it through the FDA's process. And it doesn't account for the drugs that did make it through the process but were not economically and financially viable. So what winds up happening is these pharmaceuticals, when they get a unicorn drug, they have to make all of their money on that drug. So there'll be like a 15 or so year period where there's one drug they release and they have to gouge for it because there's no way for them to make their money back otherwise. So there are some drugs where it's relatively easy to reverse engineer that process, right? And if it winds up being that you just spent $6 billion getting a drug to market, and then some other drug manufacturer says, all right, we're going to take your innovation and we're going to reverse engineer it for a cost of around $60 million, and then we're going to undersell you by, by a thousandfold on the price. Then the original company has no way to make their money back. So they have no incentive in that case to invest those billions of dollars into the innovation in the first place. So do you see how, if you don't have some sort of protection, and again, I am devil's advocating this, so don't take this the wrong way.
I'm not angry at you.
Yeah,
no, it's fine.
But like, can you see the utilitarian rationale for having a measure in place that allows for at least some protectionist policy, we'll call it, that allows for the innovator to say, yeah, okay, it's worth it to invest billions and billions and billions of dollars into this innovation if on the back end we can actually make it back?
So, all right, so I just want to follow the logic chain here, right? So you got the company, right? The company puts billions into this thing, right?
Yeah.
The regulatory environment knows that they've invested the billions, right? So they bilk the hell out of them for as much money as they can, right? And then the regulatory environment, in order to justify bilking the company for billions and billions and billions of dollars, allows them to have a monopoly on the market so that they can do that.
Okay, but imagine a situation where it's just where there is no regulatory environment in getting it to the market, and it still costs billions of dollars to get it to get it to market just because it's an expensive innovation.
So again, you have no regulatory environment, so the companies aren't lobbying for protections within that environment, right?
Yeah, and let's say it still costs billions of dollars.
Right, and so no one else knows what that company necessarily is doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're just kind of rolling the dice on what they're doing. And other people don't know what they're doing, so they're continuing to innovate, right? And maybe instead of company A that has 15 losses before a win, you have a company whose very first trial to the market is developing that product, and they decided to do that because they weren't saying, I'm not going to do it because they're already working on it. And maybe they don't have all of that money in there, right? How come it's so much less expensive to take a drug to market in Canada or China or wherever else you were saying?
Well, the regulatory environment
is so much less expensive.
Yeah.
So their medical drug prices are much lower, right? And maybe also they don't have the protections that we have, right? So you have more people in the market innovating. One of the things you have to remember is that, the argument is always, we're trying to protect the creators. Well, are you protecting the creators or are you protecting the owners of the property, right? This goes back to the, you don't protect the AI that the guy designs to do the drug research, right? The AI holds no stake in that. The guy doing the drug research who programmed the AI probably doesn't have any stake in that. It's the company that he's working for that has a stake in that drug going to the market, right? So even the person who's doing the inventing, he's not necessarily the one who's going to make the millions and billions and trillions of dollars necessarily, right? I mean, probably more often than not, that's not the case. People work for these companies under research grants because the company is going to make a bunch of money, and they pay his salary and allow him to give him staff and money and technology to be able to do the research. But that environment isn't necessarily going to change because the company's motive is to make money, and they're going to want to make more money. And if there's more competition in the market, that's really only better for everyone.
I
Maybe
don't
they end up with a
see.
skinnier margin at the end.
I don't see the incentive though to have that investment and make that invention in the first place though if there's no way to make your money in the back end. Do you see what I'm saying? Like if I've got the microchip,
What did
I'm
people do before
inventing.
the protection?
Let's say I'm inventing the microchips. It's the 1970s, and let's say I'm inventing the microchip, and it costs the effective equivalent of billions of dollars for me to invent the microchip, right? And this is a groundbreaking, this is a landmark invention. But if you have the chip already in the market, then another manufacturer can say, well, this isn't too hard. We can figure this out. And in figuring that out, instead of spending billions on that, they wind up spending a few million on it. Well, then how can I possibly compete with how can I possibly produce a price that is going to compete with their cost basis and their cost structure in a way that allows me to ever make that billions of dollars in investment back? I just don't see how there would be an incentive for me to invent the microchip in the first place.
Well, that risk is inherent to business.
Right. So then you stifle innovation in that environment.
Absolutely not. You just change the motivation.
Well, the motivation to improve one's condition is going to always be the motivation to improve one's condition. And that's what profit is a reflection of.
So then why would anyone stop?
Because profit is a reflection of that. You don't better your state if you wind up losing your money, right? Like if I invest in the stock market, for example, actually let's take something
all
even.
The time. You're a musician. How much money have you spent on music here?
Say that again.
You're a musician, right? You play guitar and stuff.
I
Right?
am not a musician, but yeah, I can play a guitar. Yeah.
So you own a guitar.
Yeah,
right?
I own a guitar. Yeah, I own a few actually.
So, right, you own more than one, right?
Yep.
So even though you're not a gigging musician out there, or whatever, you still invested in your hobby.
Right, because the improvement in my condition is the satisfaction it brings to me. So this is kind of like, with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have your basic needs like food, shelter, food and water and oxygen, and then your safety needs, and above that is social and family, and those can interchange depending on how you want to stack that. And above that is self-actualization. Well, the guitar is something that allows me to self-actualize. So it makes me, feel better about myself. This is why charity actually exists, because people have a need to want to feel like they're doing good, right? That they want to feel like they're doing the right thing. They're improving themselves, just from a moralistic standpoint.
And everyone should feel better by reaching out to Camilla's cupboard and, seeing how they can help, and dropping off some food.
Link is in the comments section, everybody, and we'll come back to that towards the end here. But yeah, so the profit motive is nothing more than the incentive to improve one's condition. And if you just set your money on fire, you're not improving your condition.
What benefit is there? There's no other. So what you're assuming is that there's no other benefit, right, other than the monetary gain from doing the thing.
Not necessarily, but
there most definitely is. Looking at pure innovation, most pure innovators don't innovate for the gain. They innovate because that's what they do.
But you're pulling people out of the market who are innovating for the gain, right? And then dumping
so many people back in because they're stopped by that megalith, or they look at the megalith and go, I'm never going to be able to beat them. Or they look at the patents and go, man, they've already got the patent there, so why am I going to continue down that path of research, right? And you lose so much more along the way, right?
But if something takes $1 billion investment, if it takes a $10 billion capital investment, then you have to have the $10 billion already existing. And if that $10 billion isn't going to be spent on that innovation, the innovation is never going to come to fruition. So what that means is that people who have that $10 billion in many cases are going to want to make more than that $10 billion back.
Is that a necessary statement? It is necessary to spend $10 billion in order to get from point A to point B?
In that moment, yes. In that moment, we're talking about a hypothetical, so yes.
Well, but I don't think that's a fair hypothetical statement to make. I think there's so many more innovations that happen just because just because of the course of doing business, right?
How would you reflect on the Manhattan
Washing
Project?
hands. I just watched a thing on it was or I didn't watch it. I did watch a short clip, but I just watched it was the other day was the guy who came up with the idea of washing your hands as a sanitary precaution for doctors, right? That guy didn't come up with that idea because had some monetary gain in it. He came up with that idea because he was trying to figure out why the midwives um, had a lower death rate of mothers postpartum than the doctors had, right? So he was looking at this situation going, man, like how come the doctors are killing all these women and the midwives aren't, right? And there was this whole decision tree and like, years of research that went into this thing. And what he came up with was the doctors who were going to the labor department went there before or after they were in the mortuary or doing something else, like they would be practicing on corpses, and then a woman would come in to give birth, and they wouldn't clean their hands before they went to help the woman give birth, right? So they were infecting her with dead cells from the corpse that they were working on, right? And this was a transcendent decision, right? Should he have been able to patent that idea? Like, hey, hand washing, you got to pay me, right? Like, no. And he didn't do that research solely because there was some monetary gain in it. He did it because his purpose was saving lives. So a drug company that's in the business of saving lives isn't looking at it from the perspective. The guy doing the research isn't looking at it as, I need to make money in order to, to save lives. He's saying, I want to figure out how to save lives.
And that's wonderful. And that's wonderful. And that's laudable. But like, businesses aren't going to exist to just set money on fire. Like you own your own business. Would you do it if you were losing money perpetually? Would there be at some point?
I feel that way so often.
But you see what I'm saying? Like, would you build a deck? Would you build a deck, right? For somebody you know nothing about, who said, you know what, I'm gonna stiff you. I'm just gonna stiff you, right? Like, and let's say.
No, you know what? No, I wouldn't. But that's not my passion, right? Like that's not something. I guess it kind of is. I mean, it's kind of my passion. I enjoy doing it. So the profit for me has always been secondary. So I guess that's kind of a bad argument, for me. I don't always hit a home run, but at the end of the day, as long as I can feed my family, I'm happy.
Exactly. Like, you do have to eat. It's an unfortunate fact of life. Like, it's inconvenient that we have to eat, but we do, right? So.
So there is profit motive involved, but to that same accord, excuse me. I think that there are a lot of things that I do that are not for profit, that are self-actualization sort of events, volunteering in local government or for charities or what have you. I mean, lots of those things happen that way, and maybe what you would see is instead of a shift for profit motive, right? Maybe what you would see was endowments and charities picking up in these fields because they understand and they know how much research is currently done, by the American Cancer Society or these other organizations that are effectively charitable organizations, right?
Right. Built on the back of somebody else's profit.
Well, built on the back of profit, of course, but for a different reason, And maybe the idea is that a lot of these things where you would have to have that massive amount of research, maybe that's not the best place to have profit motive, especially when you're dealing with things like healthcare. So, should there be people out there who do it? Sure. And if they can do it, great, but maybe you just say, hey, we have a little bit of a loss, because there's so many other places where creativity is stifled as a result. And technology is a huge one.
I totally get that. Like, I hate the notion of somebody being able to protect an idea. Like, let's say talk about gunpowder, because gunpowder could have been simultaneously invented in the Middle East and in China, right? And that is a game-changing invention that totally and utterly changes your civilization forever. Right. It's one of the great innovations of mankind. Not great in the sense of it is a wonderful thing. It's just one of these like landmark. Has your civilization invented gunpowder yet? Right.
Right.
And the notion that somebody in the Middle East can simultaneously invent that with somebody in China, and neither one of and one of them is going to be screwed out of being able to make use of that invention, right? And to improve his own life and therefore improve the lives of everyone around him. I hate that idea, but at the same time, I kind of understand that there is Henry Ford 100% did not invent the assembly line because he was trying to be a nice dude. He 100% invented the assembly line so that he could sell his products much cheaper, introduce a much larger market on what was basically a novelty item at the time, right? Like automobiles before Henry Ford were a novelty, an absolute novelty. And then they became, something that was starting to enter the home on a regular basis because Henry Ford could afford to sell his car, his Model T, A, whatever, for much lower than what everyone else could afford. And then as a result of that innovation of the assembly line process, places like, Levitt invented the Levittown, right? Where you have an assembly line process for building homes that allows you to build, say, 1,000 homes.
But here's a perfect example of a game-changing idea that wasn't protected by any sort of patent, that changed industries far and wide. McDonald's, Levittown, right? The construction industry, right?
Right, but he was able to make a profit on that. So I don't know that if
he made a profit, even though his idea was stolen by all of these other people and all of these other industries, he was still able to actualize a competitive advantage in his market because of innovation, right?
So
that made him a more powerful player, even though I'm sure other people who were automobile manufacturers went, "How the hell is he doing that?" and figured out a way to find out what he was doing.
So do you believe that in a non-regulatory environment, like what we had in 1910, right? Like basically no FDA in 1910. In fact, there was no FDA in 1910, right? There's no regulatory environment in getting these products to market. Okay. Do you think that there does not exist a product where the only way it's going to come to market is if somebody is with a colossal investment that somebody has to be able to make back on the back end, but which is also incredibly easy to reverse engineer for a hell of a lot less money? Is there a drug, let's say, that is, even without the regulatory environment, is going to cost $3.5 billion to get to market just because it's an incredibly complex invention, but that once it comes to market, it's actually pretty easy to reverse engineer, and somebody else can invest $60 million into reverse engineering it and then completely undercut the person who invented it in the first place?
Well, so, do I think that it's fair?
No. Do you think that it could exist?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of places that could exist. But I also think that in the manufacturing process, a lot of manufacturers can, think out their pricing model based on that tree of competition and pricing and availability and how many people will be able to afford a specific product in order to have a payback period over a certain period of time, right? Flat screen TVs, they came on the market thousands of dollars for a 24-inch TV, right?
Yeah.
And today you can go into Walmart and buy a 24-inch flat screen monitor
No, you can't.
Probably $99. Well,
no, I know you honestly can't, because we've gotten to a point technologically where you can't even get 24 inches anymore. You're talking like 30 inches and more.
Right, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember my father-in-law got one that was like 20 inches, and he was like, "Oh my God, it's a flat screen! I'm gonna hang it on my wall," and like sent us pictures.
And it was like $1,300. Yeah.
Yeah, it was stupid expensive, right? But Sony packaged into their pricing that people like him would go out and buy it early, and later on their pricing goes down. The manufacturing process and tooling and all those sorts of things also play a role in that pricing structure. So yeah, do I think that there's the possibility that a business might go out of business because they make a bad decision and dump too much money into innovation without being able to support?
I'm suggesting a hypothetical where the only way it comes to market is with that $3.5 billion investment.
But think about now the market that you have, where you might have people simultaneously working on a technology, and the person that hits that benchmark first wins, and the other company, or dozens of companies, or hundreds of companies, right? As
first mover advantage, yeah.
Right. Lose out, and now they have to reverse engineer around that first person's technology or give them money. And I don't think that's fair either, because you've had all of these other people who might be there at the cusp, or maybe at the same time even develop the technology but not send the paperwork in fast enough. So
So there's a difference
or not have
between
the money to.
so there's a difference in this hypothetical between the cost to reverse engineer it and the cost to bring it to market in the first place, right? So,
So
let's say we've got a drug where there's just no way to bring it to market initially, because we have hindsight. Let's say, right? Like we'll talk about some innovation that came to market in the 80s. It's some hypothetical, right? Where even if there was no regulatory market like the FDA, even if it was a truly free market with the drug itself, it's going to mean $3.5 billion to get it to get the researchers to come up with, to run the tests and make sure it works and to get it to actually come to market, right? And a lot of that is just paying guys to sit in a room and throw ideas at a wall, right? Because there's just no other way to do it, right? And then you come up with that eureka moment. You do your testing, and it costs a fortune to do the testing because you don't know what the effects are going to be in human trials. And in order to convince humans to actually go to the trial with this, you got to pay them like $50,000, to actually go to human trials, which of course you're going to do before you bring a drug to market, even without the regulatory market. And then you bring it to market, and some other company says, "Here it is. We'll put it in our centrifuge, break out the individual parts, and $60 million later, we've figured this out. We can now manufacture this for 1/1000th the price that you're selling it for." So now all of that money that you've invested to bring the drug to market is gone. Now, in the world where we have hindsight, right? Why would that person who initially made the drug come to market? Why would that investment group get back that investment? Right? Like I'm not seeing how they would back that investment, and I'm not seeing how that invention would otherwise come to market when you're knowing in hindsight there's no way.
You're putting a clause into the argument that I see as being invalid.
What's that?
Excuse me again. I don't think that you need to have the investment group in order to be able to get the drugs and put them to market. I think that clause in itself, that for some reason, that there's a requirement that people be doing something specifically for profit, is the only way that you're going to get to that end goal of getting that life-saving drug.
And that's not what I'm arguing, though.
For that technology. Well, you are, because you're saying, why would a group of people who have profit motive do this thing? Well, they wouldn't, but someone else would. Those people who are working on the project, who have a passion for the topic, who aren't the ones with the profit motive, right? They're still going to do that work and that research because that's what they do, because that's their life's goal, because that's their self-actualization, is going into a laboratory and playing with things and playing with the drugs and playing with chemicals to try to do this and try to do that, right? And the fact that we've introduced the capitalist function is what's hemorrhaging the system, right? The reason drug prices in the US are so expensive is because the drug companies have profit motive. Now, not only do they have profit motive in keeping the drugs or innovating new drugs, but they also have a profit motive in keeping other people out of the market. And a lot of the times, to be honest with you, not necessarily coming up with the best drug that should be brought to market, the most effectual drug.
Right. So you're pulling those, but you're pulling those.
Argument where he all of a sudden owns the patent on a life-saving drug and jacks up the price because he knows people need it to save their lives.
And because he's invested all that money in it.
Well, but it's a disgusting premise from the beginning. We shouldn't be having that profit motive in the market where someone can invest money in something that is a life-saving,
But why would the money get invested there in the first place? Because you're pulling that innovator off the market. Maybe that's the only innovator that has the ability to do that.
Well,
right? Maybe the eureka moment is because Frank is working for this profit motive company, right? And Frank is the guy that came up with the invention, and he's not going to work for this company unless they're paying him bank.
But he would still do the research anyway, right?
No. If he's not getting paid to do the research, he's not going to do it.
Says who?
It says the necessary elements of this hypothetical. If Frank is the one that has it, eureka moment.
That's a very specific thing. But again,
exactly.
Just like you play guitar and you derive absolutely no profit motive from it, right?
Well, I do
because that's your self-actualization.
I do because the gain I'm realizing is the self-actualization.
But no monetary gain, right? I mean, like you're not getting paid by a corporation, right? Exactly. So that's my argument. My argument is My argument is that there are still doctors out there who are going to do this research anyway because that's what they do. The guy who
how
sits
many
in his room and
guitarists?
studies.
Right, but there are going to be guitarists, and I'm using this hypothetical because this is not the nature of guitarists, right? And you know this, but there are going to be guitarists who'd pick up a guitar to make money, which means that the number of guitarists that are going to be in the market, if you remove any way to make money off of that, is going to be decline, which means that the number of people who are available for that artistic creative element has declined, which means that your opportunities to see more innovations. Let's say Jimmy Page only was in it for the money. Then we don't get Stairway to Heaven.
That's exactly my argument. They're going to do it anyway. You're still going to get Stairway to Heaven.
You can't get so you're not going to get Stairway to Heaven without Jimmy Page.
What you won't get is Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera and the corporate sputum that gets shoved down our throat because you have profit motive in the industry, right? If you go back to before those protections, right? There were bands of musicians that went around and played songs and played standards and innovated and did all of those things at a nightclub just to make $100 or whatever, $1, $10, whatever it is. And the market was so much more rich at that particular point in time than it is today, right?
Well, I mean,
whereas today, everything comes out that's cookie cutter. It's got to be marketable. You have to have the right person and the right look and the right thing and the right thing and the right thing. And how much is lost as a result of that? One of the best things to come out of the war for intellectual property in the music environment is a decentralization and making these giant megaliths insignificant by having social media, right? Now artists are promoting themselves and the power has been shifted from the corporation that says you have to make us money and you have to do this thing for money to people who are just doing it. And then if they get enough people around them, all of a sudden they're making money.
Yeah.
Right?
And then once they've made the money, they can afford to go on tour, right? And then introduce their music to more people. That's the profit motive right there, actually working in their favor. Now back to Jimmy Page though. We have to address this point. We have to address this point. Like Stairway to Heaven is not ever there have been how many billions of people on this earth and one person came up with Stairway to Heaven, right? Like I know I'm attributing probably more to Jimmy Page with Stairway to Heaven than I should be.
What did we say early on? A monkey bashing a keyboard long enough writes Hamlet, right?
All right. Do you actually want to go into the math behind that? Because it's actually not true.
So do you think it's 36 it's 36 to the 163,600 and something. I forget what the number is.
Yeah, there's 123,000. It's something times 10 to the 123,000. It's something like if you had if every proton ever to have existed in the history of the universe and will ever exist in the history of the universe until its death was a monkey at a typewriter, it would take something like 10 to some order of magnitude universes to get even so much as I think it was like the first page of Hamlet. Like it's just never, ever happened.
So, but at the same time, right? Shakespeare did all of his things, right? And he wrote great stuff
because he was Shakespeare, though. Like Chaucer is not writing Shakespeare,
but he did it.
Marlowe is not writing Shakespeare,
right?
Shakespeare writes Shakespeare.
Jimi Hendrix isn't writing Jimmy Page. They're both great guitar players,
right? But we don't get Stairway to Heaven without that. I mean, we don't do
good guitar players,
dude. How like
Jimmy Page or Jimmy who have not ever made $1 in music, and they just do it because that's what they do,
right? And that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. But let's say that Jimi Hendrix and Jimmy Page only were in it for the money, even though we both know that they weren't, right? But let's say they were only in it for the money, and there was no way for them to make any money.
Jimmy Page then we don't get.
Then we don't get Hey Joe.
Eric Clapton definitely was.
Well, yeah, that's probably true. But like at the same time, like
Hey Joe, was it Hey Joe? Hold on, now I have to Google this.
Tim Leary gave us the version of Hey Joe that we all know that Hendrix covered. So
it was a cover,
right? But Purple Haze wasn't. Purple Haze wasn't.
It was a cover.
Purple Haze wasn't.
But that's the thing, right? So I wonder what the Hey Joe was a cover. I think actually most of Hendrix's big hits were all covers.
Right? Well, the biggest of the biggest, you'd be surprised how many were covers, but most of his material was in no way covers. So Axis Bold as Love, I think, had one stanza that was a cover. But yeah, so you're talking about like All Along the Watchtower is a cover of Dylan. Hey Joe is a cover of, and in this case, Timothy Leary. It's an old folk song that I think the Leaves own the original copyright to, but it's an old folk song that nobody really knows the history of. What was another one? Yeah, there was one more that everybody knows, which is actually a cover. I can't think of what it would be. He actually has three songs that are by Dylan that are originally Dylan songs that he's covered that were minor hits. But yeah, Fire was originally him. Foxy Lady was originally him. I'm trying to just go through the hits. Little Miss Strange was actually Noel Redding, which is,
So here's an interesting one, right? So like Happy Birthday, right?
Oh my
You
God.
ever wonder why when you go to Chili's, right?
They
don't
corny,
sing Happy Birthday,
right?
Right? It's always some corny thing, right?
Yep.
The reason for that is because at some point someone owned the rights. I don't know how they got to owning the rights to Happy Birthday. It's kind of such a ubiquitous song to Happy Birthday, right? And I believe at some point Michael Jackson actually owned the rights to Happy Birthday, if I'm not mistaken.
Could be. He owned the rights to everything.
Don't quote me on that. Right. He owned the rights to Beatles songs before his death. And the irony there was that he actually bought the Beatles out underneath from
McCartney.
Paul McCartney.
Yeah.
Because they were having a conversation. He's like, oh, my rights are coming up. So Michael Jackson outbid him for his own music.
Yeah. So Happy Birthday is actually.
How does that morally make any sense?
No. And I'm with you, Joe. Like, I hate it.
I say
I hate it.
Take it all out of there. That's the whole thing.
So
right? It's like, if you do you really think the Beatles wouldn't have gone out and written all those songs if there was no profit motive?
I think that there are songs that they wouldn't have written because they wouldn't have been in music anymore.
They're like Thanos. They're inevitable.
I don't think that they were, though, without a market to actually promote them. Right? Because when they were just the Silver Beatles, when they were just the Quarrymen in Berlin, right? Like, nobody heard of them. Like nobody heard of them. Like, they didn't get heard of until they were the Beatles. And then I would go so far as to argue, and I'm still kind of playing devil's advocate, but do we get Abbey Road if they wind up staying as the Quarrymen in Berlin, or do they wind up saying, you know what, we got to get jobs, we got to eat, and that's going to take away from our creative time?
I think the reason they were in Berlin was to work a gig at a strip club, and that's what they were doing, is they were gigging to eat. Right? That's literally what they were doing.
Yep.
Putting in their 10,000 hours and getting there, or, whatever, if you believe in that or not, whatever.
Whatever.
Getting their experience under their belt so that they could then transcend that act of getting their 10,000 hours in and become the Beatles that we knew. And they would have done that music regardless of whether or not they would have become lifetime rock star hits. Now, whether or not they leveraged their fame to do even greater and greater and greater things once they were capitalized, that's an entirely different argument that we could have another time. But you still go out to see the Beatles, right? Because they're the Beatles, there are bands every night of the week that do covers of whatever band you want to think of, Metallica, Iron Maiden, Megadeth, Alan Jackson. There's someone out there tonight doing an Alan Jackson cover, right?
Yeah, probably.
So someone's going to go and see Alan Jackson do that song because he's Alan Jackson. Right.
But
they don't want to see the guy doing the cover. They want to see Alan Jackson, the guy who originally did the song, and he can capitalize on that to a greater degree.
Yeah,
right?
I don't see how.
And the guy doing the covers.
Yeah, I don't see how. Like, Please Please Me, the album, right, which featured basically every one of their early hits. Right. I Want to Hold Your Hand. Was Money Can't Buy Me Love on that one? Was 8 Days a Week on that? No, 8 Days a Week was not on that one. But it doesn't matter. Like, Please Please Me had, like, I Saw Her Standing There. It had Love Me Do, right? All of those big hits. I don't think you get with the Beatles if there wasn't the unbelievable amount of money involved with, getting them on tour and getting people to buy these albums, right? Which you don't have if you don't have the money to go to the US. Because they had heard of them and they liked them.
They had heard of them and they liked them, right?
Right. And the reason they heard of them is because
now you have artists today. Now you have artists today, and maybe this is just a different environment. And
it's a very different environment.
We're right, and we're looking back on the 60s and the 70s, 60s and 70s, right? Yeah.
Well, technically 1970s, let it be, but yeah.
Yeah. and looking back on those things with the lens that we have today, but I would argue that today that level of capitalization is not really necessary, you know? So why do we still have a construct in place to protect the industry the way that it was back then today? And this is an entirely a
Yeah, it
different
is.
argument.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that that's definitely relevant in the conversation, because you can have a different level of innovation today than you could have 100 years ago. Now AI is going to do a lot of your med research, right? So why couldn't we say that there's a guy who has the AI who doesn't have to put in all that time and all that money, and they can do a genomic evaluation of a virus and say, hey, if we try these specific things based on the knowledge that we currently have, we can do that, and you don't need that capitalization. Why are they still covered under the same protections, assuming that you have that requirement that we had 100 years ago, right?
Well, I
Um,
mean, it's
I guess
we,
not
we
100
talked
years
we
ago.
talked about
It
this
would be
before the show that like if you invent a hoe that allows you to till the soil so that you can grow vegetable crops in an area that you normally wouldn't have, then obviously you have right to those crops. I mean, it's a different type of property argument, but the AI is something so we talked about how it has to come back from the human element, right? So whatever the AI does is effectively an extension by proxy of the invention of a human being at some point, right? So and what I'm arguing here, Joe, is that at some point a human being has to have that eureka moment, and there are people that won't be working towards that eureka moment if there isn't a profit motive involved in all of this. And it's not to
and
say
my
that
argument is that they absolutely will. They will
well,
still be working towards that eureka moment,
I'm
because
not.
that's
I'm
what
not going
people
to say
do.
that there's not going to be anyone working towards that motive. I'm saying that there are people who will not be working towards that motive. There are people that are only going to be in it for the money. As Frank Zappa said, we're only in it for the money, right? It was a joke, but you know, like I think
Why
that
do we incentivize that?
so that we can
Is
have
that
more
the
people
best
come to
person?
market, so that we can have more people
Is
come
that
to
the
market
best
who are
person?
doing that thing.
Do you know what happened when the stock market started blowing up and
When
and restrictions I mean, let's go back to, like, I guess it would be like the 90s, post the market crash in the 80s, right? There's an influx of people as financial advisors in the financial market because the regulatory environment in medicine was increasing, profit motive was going down, and those minds were all going towards the finance industry, right? People with medical degrees, people with uh, you know, degrees in math and science and all of these brain surgery and all these sorts of things, right? Um, do we necessarily want those people in the financial market because that's where the incentive is,
yes,
right? I mean, I guess you could argue that that is exactly where we want them, or
right,
is
because
there a better use for them in a place elsewhere in the market where maybe they feel like they're not, you know what I mean? Like there, I don't know that you want those people being brain surgeons if the only reason they're going to be a brain surgeon is for money, right? That's not going to give you the best caring, brain surgeon in the world, right?
well,
That's not going to be the guy who's going to do the most good in that particular environment. I
I would
also would
argue.
say that that person who's chasing that profit motive isn't the guy you want in the financial markets, because they're going to make decisions based on personal profit and personal gain
Of
over the
course.
good of the community at large.
Of course they are. But
And that's not
that's what the
right.
profit
And
motive
that's
is. So the profit motive is nothing more than improving your station. Obviously, a financial advisor isn't going to take Joe's money and literally set it on fire. You'd be furious if he did that, right? And he makes no money off of all that. So
But
obviously,
also don't want him making decisions that are in his best interest and not mine.
well, what's going to be in
And
his best interest in an unregulated market is what is necessarily in your best interest, especially when you have a very broad
if
protection of free speech, right? Because
Mike,
if you
if that were the
if
case,
he just
we have laws.
no, if he just
We wouldn't
weasels
need
if he just weasels that
if
money away, right? If he lies to you, first things first, that's an element of deceit. So there's already a libertarian argument for the government to step in when you've introduced the element of deceit, right? But if there is no deceit and he's telling you up front that he's just going to pocket your cash, right, and blow it on a Corvette, right? Then, you have the right then to go on to Yelp and say this guy's a F face, right? Don't invest your money with him. Right. And then of course it's going to be no longer in his best interest to blow that money on that Corvette. And that's, I mean, there are things that a free market requires, which is the broad protection of free speech, so that you can have these sort of things come to fruition. And it also does require that in a situation where where consent is removed and where you basically don't have a free market, you do need a governing body to step in and reintroduce consent to the market. So I guess what I'm saying is the argument that I'm suggesting, it's a utilitarian one, right? There is utility in having the protection for the intellectual property. It is not a moralistic argument, because I'm on board with you. I hate the notion that Michael Jackson can prevent Paul McCartney from playing Let It Fucking Be. Like, that just blows my mind. Like, why in the world is that the case? But at the same time, I see some utility in having some protection. Now, if we're going to keep it in that manner, here's how I envision, meeting both ends of these arguments, right? And that is, imagine a world where you have an intellectual property protection that is just simply fine. We'll give you sole rights to that concept, and for the ability to make money off of that concept for 10 years, non-transferable except for by death. If you make your money back, great. If you don't, tough luck. We gave you 10 years to make your money back, right? And that to me is where, like, if the Beatles licensed their works, their material in 1963, right? You have till 1973 to make your money back. And for God's sakes, if you're the Beatles, you're going to make your money back, right? Because you have that protection. Now, it's a very different environment in 1963 than what we have today, where you can pirate music unbelievably easily. And I think the same thing is true of pharmaceuticals. Like, if you have to invest a colossal, ever-loving F-ton into this pharmaceutical, into this cure for cancer, and you need to have as many people working on it as you possibly can. You need to pay as many Frank, Joe, Sam, Bill, Sally, Rachel, etc., Stephanie, Emily, to be working on this. Like, you need as much money as you possibly can and to have all of these genius minds, so that you can have one of them have that eureka moment and say, aha, every one of these transmissions that the Nazis are sending out end with Heil Hitler, so we can use Heil Hitler to reduce the amount of code we need to break their code, right? And you need that one person who makes that aha moment, and it's impossible to tell who that's going to be. So it's going to take, having, 3,000 engineers on staff just throwing ideas at the wall, and that costs billions of dollars, rather than having just sit back, have 3 engineers reverse engineer it, millions of dollars, and now all of that money is gone. And Frank, Sally, Emily, Stephanie, Jim, James, there's no reason to keep them employed, because how in the world can you afford to keep them employed? Now, I get it. There are such things as charities. I get it. But even they are going to want to have as many people employed as they possibly can, which means that in reality, if they can make some money back on that, which is why Elon Musk is the perfect example of this. Elon Musk holds his patents for 2 or 3 years, right? And it's only so he can make his money back. And then he releases them into the public domain. Right. And I've done this myself with certain things that I've put together, where it's clearly something that would be normally protected by intellectual property, but where I've said, you know what, I have no way of making money off of this, so fuck it, off into the public domain it goes. Right. And that's just from a moral standpoint. That's the way I would operate. But that's not how everybody's going to operate. And there are going to be people out there who are only going to be in it for the money. And the only way you can maximize the number of people doing these wonderful things is to allow for those people who are only in it for the money to be doing the things that they would only do if there's money. So again, Joe, I'm totally on board with you. I hate it.
And I agree with you.
Yeah. I wish there was a way to do this where we could include those billion-dollar investments and have some way for them to be absolutely sure that they're going to make their money back in the back end. Because there's no way that that there are certain cases where there's no way those innovations are happening, at least in the moment, right? Right. With gunpowder, we talked about, like, some genius had the idea to make gunpowder in China 1,500 years ago, or whatever it was, probably less than 1,500 years ago, but more than 1,000 years ago. Somebody in China had the idea to come up with gunpowder, right? And if that guy hadn't invented it, I agree with you. Maybe somebody somewhere along the line would have invented it. But we had an entire hemisphere, 2 whole continents that had no gunpowder, no steel, had basically no metallurgy,
Yeah.
had barely
Yeah.
agriculture in many cases. So it's not a guarantee that it's going to happen really at all, let alone for thousands of years in certain cases. It's like the reason the Industrial Revolution happened in it when it did is because of the environment that existed for it to happen. So yeah, I mean, I think we're going to have to call it quits there because I think we've come to a pass, right? Like, I wish there was a way to not have these sort of things. I just don't see it.
Well, I can appreciate you not seeing it because I don't see the necessity for it. I
Yeah,
mean, I really do think
and
that,
when it comes
I
when
don't
it
think the
comes down
guy
to
that
it,
invented gunpowder made $1 billion off of it. I think he was just some guy and he shared that knowledge with his
could be,
buddy, and his buddy shared it with his buddy, and
could
you know,
be, could
um,
be, but there are certain inventions that are not going to happen unless you get some guy who's just only in it for the money. There are some of those inventions, and you
absolutely,
may not.
and there's still a place in the market for it, even if he doesn't have the intellectual property
Right, and
protection.
the microprocessor, I think, is the perfect example of that because I forget who invented the microprocessor, but I'm very sure that they were basically only in it for the money, and nobody was going to invent that thing for a very long time after that. Right, like that was one genius's eureka moment. So,
I don't know enough about it to
all
say
right,
so.
hey, so since we're basically at a point where you're going to say I could see it happening, and I'm at a point where I can't see it happening. There's really no way to go any further than that. Do you want me to go to the
I'm with
chat
you.
and see what people have to say and see if we want to pull them in?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. All right, so let's go
Is there
into
a
the
chance
chat.
for me to go to the bathroom?
Yeah. Actually, you know what? I wish I had an intermission screen, folks, because I kind of have to use the potty too. We are we are 35 and over, and we're guys, so we got to pee every once in a while. So we will be right back. Okay, we are back. Excuse us, folks. Joe, you can hear me now, right?
I can hear you now.
All right, wonderful. Okay, so let's go into the chat and see what people have to say. Wow, I wish this would not be so poorly done. Uh, Ray Lillis, what's the biggest inches you guys ever had? I'm not sure what what that means. All right,
I really don't know.
Ray, I have no idea what that means. Asking for a friend. Dan Rice, that's a completely bogus argument you have. Competing formats VHS versus beta Blu-ray versus high def. Even if Joe comes out with a product A that Bob has been also working on. Oh God, it's scrolling on me. All right, so even if Joe comes out with a product A that Bob has been also working on, as long as Bob makes it unique enough, he can still enter the market with a different type of product. Format matters. Okay.
Yeah, it's yeah.
Stephen, all right, most of these things are complex enough such that there are multiple paths to similar solutions. One guy's patent doesn't prevent another guy from finding another path. Well, that's fair.
But that's a viable argument.
That's
Absolutely.
very fair. That maybe there's another way to achieve the goal. But if we're talking about
That's
something
also
where
oh,
but like there may only be in a certain given time frame one guy who's come up with a solution to that goal. And if the only way that he's actually going to come to that is if there is some way for somebody in the back end to make the money back, then again, you're delaying that until something else comes along. So I get it. I totally get it.
But that's also the argument. Like I started to touch on this earlier, where I had a friend who came up with an idea for technology, and he went out into the market to try to shop that technology to, venture capitalists, and he had some money behind him. And at a certain point, he kind of ran out of funding, and so he looked to larger businesses in order to put out his product. And basically, what the larger businesses did is just circumvent his patents, right? So to a certain degree, the patent in itself is a barrier to entry, right? That's like,
I'm sorry, I'm reading some of these comments and some of them are really good.
That's okay.
Yeah. So Ray Lewis, how is that how you came up with this show through a few days at your mom's basement wall? Yeah, no, unfortunately, no, I don't live with my mom anymore. I miss Saturday morning cartoons. Dan Rice, exactly. Ray Lewis, $10 says one of these two guys don't have pants on.
I mean, I don't have pants on, but I have shorts on.
Yeah, I mean, I've got my gym shorts on, right? Like nobody's going to see the gym shorts. Yeah.
It's neck up only. So.
Yeah, so you win $10, Ray. Stephen Boston, except those guys are on somebody else's payroll. Typically, those people are interested in. Okay, so I'm going to have to just go through this. We invest so much money into John Pettibone. If an electrical property is such a bad thing, why does the United States have just about as many patents filed each year as the rest of the world combined? Not exactly, but pretty close comparison. All right, let me read this again because there might be a point here to talk about. If an electrical property is such a bad thing, why does the United States have just about as many patents filed each year as the rest of the world combined? Not exactly, but pretty close comparison. Well, I would argue that the reason there are so many patents filed in the U.S. is twofold. Number one, we actually have a very protectionist patent system. I think you agree with that. And number two, outside of the patent system, three reasons actually. Outside of the patent system, the market is fairly free market. It's fairly capitalist, not compared to something like Denmark or the Netherlands, which have an underlying market which is extremely capitalist, or like the UAE or Hong Kong prior to the Chinese takeover, or Singapore. Singapore is a perfect example of something where they, in terms of their underlying economic structure, it's incredibly free market. The third reason that you have all of these patents being filed in the U.S. is because the U.S. is 330 million people. We're the richest country ever to have existed, so we have that huge capital backing to invest in certain things that are going to require billions and millions of dollars that you don't have in Uganda or that you don't have in Mongolia. So huge capital backing, really protective patent environment, which I think is way too protective, and an underlying market which is pretty capitalist. So, I mean, do you disagree with any of that, Joe?
No, I just think that we've gotten to the point where that's where the incentive is, right? I mean, that's so people are just chasing the incentive. It's not.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. I'm not saying that those reasons are good or bad things. It's just I think those are the three reasons people come to the U.S. to file patents.
And to have access to our markets, right? I mean, you don't want to bring something to market in the U.S. and have someone reverse engineer it and then patent it on you.
Right. All right. So, God, Ray, you're killing me here, man. I'll pay you to play Freebird. All right.
I mean, sure.
Can we talk of Ricardo Lathers? Can we talk about Joe's ponytail? Do you want to talk about Joe's ponytail?
I mean, I like my hair.
Yeah.
That's about as far as I'll go with that conversation.
Hey, folks! I went to college once. I had long hair. Anybody know the hillbilly Shakespeare? Hendrik Sock, Chuck Berry invented rock and roll. Okay, here we go. This is something we could probably work with. Dan Rice. Mike's analogy is 100% correct. If Jimmy Page is in it for the money and he figures it out that he will not make money by releasing Stairway to Heaven, he never writes Stairway to Heaven, so we don't get the benefit from it. He has a right to get paid for his intellectual creation. The world is deprived of Stairway to Heaven if Jimmy Page is not permitted to make money. provided he's in it for the money. So I think it's touching up on what we talked about, because I think the argument that I was making is that if he doesn't have the protection to make that money, he's not going to make that money, right? Because it's just going to get pirated. So why would he do that in the first place? And I think we went over that in enough detail. You disagree with me? I don't think there's more to say about that.
My disagreement is that the motive is not necessarily there.
Closer to the mic, please.
Money. Oh,
you're starting to do this.
Yeah, I'm starting to fall asleep. Yeah. It's after my bedtime. I'm old.
Yeah.
I don't think that you necessarily need the motive there to be paying back the capital investment that the artist. Well, I mean, I guess it is, right? Like that's what you get paid for. You get paid for your expertise. I don't know. Yeah. I'm lost on that one.
Yeah. Okay. So it seems like there's some debate over this comment, basically. I think Joe's position is that people create only for the joy of creating. In my experience, people get a kick out of creating, but we monetize it. So I think he's saying basically the same thing that I said, that yes, there are plenty of people that create just for the sake of creating, and there are also people who are only in it for the money.
But I think that there are a lot of creators out there who don't make enough money because of things that are barriers to entry to the market, like patents. And I think that you would have more creators being more creative if you didn't have the barriers to entry.
Okay, let's see. Oh, okay. This is actually an interesting thing to bring up. Also, they're not even touching on the cost of these protections. Depending on your filing strategy, there's a $10K to $50K hit just for filing the application. Now, I actually disagree with this. I think that this is not a good argument in favor of these protections, that it costs a fortune to have these protections without the government helping out with this protection. I think that if anything, I think that so let's say you've got I don't think it's a great argument, because there are certain cases where the governmental protection is required to reduce the cost of protecting the secrecy of a trade secret. But I just don't think it's a very good argument, because even if that is the case, we have to have the moralistic argument over whether that provides utility in the first place.
So here's the problem with with patent infringement in general. So you go and you apply for your copyright or your patent on your product, right?
Yep.
And the onus is only on the other individual to be able to prove that they never looked at your patent before they came up with the same idea, right? So the cost of the litigation at that point, like you don't necessarily have to pay the person back for infringing on their patent in the full amount that you would normally have to pay them, if you can prove that you never knew that their patent existed in the first place. And this was a strategy that both Samsung and HTC employed in smartphone technology, is that they just never looked it up. And they went out and did their own thing. And at a certain point, they got sued by Apple or Samsung or whoever the heck else it was, Nokia. And all they had to prove was that they didn't really do it. And then all they had to pay back was really the court costs plus some minimal fines, right? So the cost of the litigation was less than what they would have to pay for use of the patents for that period of time in the first place, right? So instead of actually paying the person who owned the patent, they just ignored it entirely.
All right, so I'm going to introduce an idea that I just came up with. See what you think about this. So all these people that are reverse engineering, like we just said, and basically bankrupting companies that have to come up with have to spend billions in the first place. Those companies, let's grant that. Just grant that for this idea. Those companies then have the financial backing, should have the financial backing to say, before we invest in that, right? If we're going to go to John Doe Chemical, who's just going to reverse engineer this, why don't, when they reverse engineer this, we go out and buy them out, or we get an agreement to say you're no longer going to make this. And it's actually my argument for getting rid of the draft, which is if you just pay people enough to join the military, they'll join the military voluntarily. And it's incredibly expensive to drum people up who don't want to join the military.
That's a whole nother conversation for another time. But the
concept
in a bizarre
is
way. Not really. I don't think so. I mean, I think what you're talking about is you're talking about
instead of having Instead of having the patent protections, have those companies that invest those billions of dollars say, all right, well, part of the added cost, because it costs a fortune to maintain the patent itself anyways, why don't we just, when the handful of engineers that can reverse engineer this come out and reverse engineer it, we just buy them out.
So you're making an argument on my point now?
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, if you're that large of a business, isn't that what you would want to do anyway? And all you're doing is adding competition in the market. So that's not a bad thing for consumers.
Right. So, I mean, it'd buy them out or sign an agreement like not to produce the thing. And if they then produce the thing, hey, you signed the agreement. We're going to court.
I mean, why not just not have the patent in the first place?
Well, that's what I'm saying is if the patent doesn't exist, then one of the ways you could protect the intellectual property would be to just buy out the people that steal it from underneath you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know if that would work, but I don't know.
Now people create things and they wait for someone to come and buy them out after the fact. I mean, it's the same thing, right? Like that's what a patent troll is. It's someone who just sits on a patent until someone needs that technology. And then they go, here's an exorbitant fee that you could pay me. It's the same thing with URLs, right? I mean, like when I've actually met more than one person who just goes online and goes on GoDaddy and, that thing's $1. That thing's $2. I mean, you want to talk about crazy. My business, Joe Fixit, right?
Yeah.
So there's a guy who who took the Joe Fixit website, joefixit.com, and tried to get me to buy it back from him for like tens of thousands of dollars. And I was like, no. So now he's got the URL. I don't know if he sold it to someone else or whatever, but there's actually a joefixit.com now. That's an Angie's List for like Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, like these sorts of things. And, and he's just sitting on it. I mean, it really doesn't do anything. It just redirects to another website. And it's just like, I don't know. It's so simple.
Yeah. Like if somebody bought like Trump 2020 in like 2016, Trump2020.com, knowing that at some point somebody's going to come up to him and say, hey, we need this.
We need this, right? Yeah. Buy it for me, right? Like,
yeah.
Like,
all right. Well, it cost me about $300 over those 4 years from GoDaddy, and it's going to sell for $50,000.
Well, but you see here now, I'm actually okay with that. I think that's a tangible thing that if someone wants to purchase as an investment, to me, it totally makes sense. It's like buying gold, right? Like you buy gold, you don't know what the price of gold is going to be in 4 years, right? So you buy some gold today in the hopes that it's worth more in 4 years. And if not, you got a bunch of gold.
It's effectively a futures.
But that's some sort of, I guess, what you could call intellectual property, although I kind of see that as being more tangible. That makes sense.
All right. Why is the door moving? Look behind you. All right, let's see. Gunpowder is one set of patents. Using it for fireworks or gunpowder are two different sets. Huh. I wonder if that's actually true.
So someone owns the rights to gunpowder. I'm going to look that up now.
But the particular use might be, two separate patents. I could see that. Under existing law, I could see that.
I mean, yeah, gunpowder. Google patents.
There's no way somebody has a patent to gunpowder.
Yeah. I don't know. 1898 on December 6th, priority US 6984, so on and so forth.
Okay, so Stephen Boston, most of my patents were done in the U.S., Singapore, and India for exactly those reasons. So the three reasons I suggested was I'm guessing is what he's referring to: a very protectionist patent market, a huge amount of capital to get these patents to market, and then and then a basically very capitalist economy to underwrite that.
So this patent I found for gunpowder is for the particular type of granularization of the powder.
Oh, so it's a process. It's a process patent.
I guess.
And not a materials patent.
I'll copy the link and send it to you.
Yeah, so it's a process patent, not a materials patent. You know the difference between the two, right?
Mhm.
Okay. Um, I agree with you, Mike. I think the cost of filing is a barrier, but it drives the play towards monetization. Okay. All
There's
right,
something to
Jeremy
be said
versus
for that.
Ron.
That the fact that we have the patent process that we have incentivizes people not just sitting on the patent.
Yeah, so I think we just went through the entire chat. There's a whole lot on here. We could check into at some point, but I think those were all the points that were brought up that were, I think, directed mostly at us. So Joe, I know it's getting kind of late for you. It's 10:30 over at your end.
Ugh.
So do we want to do another shameless plug here? Let me get that copy and pasted.
Sure. Yeah.
All right, Joe, talk about Camilla's Cupboard one last time before we sign off.
Oh yeah, sorry, man. I was listening to you so I could copy and paste the thing.
No, I already got it.
Right. So the shameless plug for us is for Camilla's Cupboard. It's a local charity that helps kids to get food when it's not available. They provide all children in New Milford year-round food access. Especially those who are in need. And they have summer lunches and brunches in school food pantries at the New Milford High School and Scotticoke Middle School, and they provide weekend and break bags. Again for students who need food who don't otherwise have access to it. And you'd be surprised how many there are. I would definitely reach out to Camilla's Cupboard at www.camillascupboard.com, and you can volunteer, give food or donate to the charity as you feel appropriate. And I'd love for everyone who's listening to get out there and do that. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, wonderful charity, Camilla's Cupboard. The link is in the comments section. Joe, this has been fun. Love to do something like this again sometime if we ever have a chance or a great topic to go over.
It's been a good time, man.
Yeah, thanks to everyone at home who's been watching this. Thanks to everybody who's been participating both on the Captain Phoenix channel on YouTube and on my page on Facebook. Until the next time, folks, it's been fun. Good night.